Okay, here we are. So again, welcome to our second session, focusing on lower watershed resilience in the Tulare Basin through advanced water strategies. It's a very long title. Nonetheless, we're dealing with some complicated opportunities here and some really great solutions as well. So some of you might be familiar with the Tulare Basin Watershed Partnership. The network is a somewhat new entity, which is really an effort to be even more collaborative in terms of taking action and innovating. So we are very excited to have you join us. So I know a number of you are already network members. Many of you are not. You're just attending for the first time. So welcome to everyone. It's great to have you. And I'm going to just jump ahead quickly to just quickly give you a little sense of the network's purpose and focus. So our purpose is to, oops, excuse me, it looks like there's something on the screen there. Whoops, sorry for motion sickness. Our purpose is to generate and implement integrated, inclusive, and innovative solutions to advance ecosystem and watershed resilience, as well as socioeconomic sustainability. So this is not just about ecological issues, it's also about social and economic ones as well. Finding opportunity in the midst of the challenges that we're facing. And then our big goal ultimately is where we're going is, and this is ambitious and it's admittedly a big, bold goal, and we're not exactly sure how to get there. That's why we need all of us working together, is to establish and enhance watershed health and resilience across the Tulare Basin by 2040. And that's aligned, as you might imagine, with the SGMA deadline, or I should say goal, not deadline, but goal. And that's by design. And we know there are many other factors than just SGMA that's driving the need for change. Nonetheless, this is what kind of one of our things we wanted to make sure we align with. So I just want to take a pause here and say, any design team members, that is leadership team members from the network that want to say hello or anything else, add anything to what I've said? Okay, I guess I've got it. And you can hear me, right? The sound is still working. Okay. All right. And I'll just say one more thing, which is sorry, my trackpad is so sensitive. There we go. So the focus, there's a little bit like our scope of work, and what we're intending to do is really focusing more at the landscape and regional scale to address resiliency and sustainability. That includes agriculture, ecological, economic, and social dimensions, as I mentioned. And our intention is to be pretty inclusive, very inclusive, actually, and also have a more systemic approach, which can sometimes be something that we love to do, but it's also can be challenging. It's complicated, it's messy, it takes more time. And that also, we are looking to interconnect all the issues that are all the efforts that are happening to support and help scale those efforts as well. So we're not trying to reinvent the wheel, we're trying to support what's already happening and connect those things together and kind of look at these larger macro scale strategies. And then the activity-wise, we're looking at doing a lot of learning, which is what we're doing today, coordinating efforts and collaborating, that is working together across boundaries, with the belief that there's strength and safety in numbers. So safety to try some new things and innovate, and strength in that more than one entity or parties working together, you can share resources, ideas, insights, and we just feel like it's an effective way for us to go. And that gives you a little sense of the network and what we're about, and that's why we're having today's session, is for us to keep learning, and we're excited to have some pretty innovative and effective strategies here. I'll just quickly touch on the agenda. So first, we're going to hear from Mike Hagman from Kaweah GSA and Lindmore Irrigation District, talking generally about GSAs and the regional conservation investment strategies, the RCIS program that you might know of. Then we're going to hear about SGMA implementation pathways and strategic land purposing from Schiller at EDF. And then last but certainly not least, trends, challenges, and opportunities across the region, kind of how these pieces start fitting together and what's kind of possible longer term. And we're going to hear from Stacie Ann Silva with New Current Water and Land LLC, who is working with a number of organizations and has a unique perspective in terms of how things are kind of shaping out in multiple domains. And then we're going to have time for discussion, which you feel is really important to help kind of explore scaling strategies in the region. We hope you'll stay for that as well. And then we'll conclude with some just closing thoughts and some next steps on other events that we have coming up in the network. So thank you while I kind of got through all the preliminaries here. As you might have heard earlier, we are recording this session for later reference. Please do stay on the call though, because we love having you live here on the call. And will also be available to others, to your colleagues and others later. And we'll also be making slides available as well. So without further ado, I would like to, I'm just going to hand this over to Mike Hagman to talk more about the RCIS.
Great, thank you, Robert. Let me begin a screen share.
And I'll stop. There we go.
So, good afternoon. I just thought I'd start off with a little bit of sensible humor. Why do we have an RCIS? And I think we have a marriage, hopefully between the Kaweah subbasin and RCIS, but obviously we don't have a model that's fully deployed and showing results at this point in the state for RCIS. Okay. So what I wanted to share is just a real briefly my perspective. So I farm here in Porterville, a small Tango farm, about 12 acres. I manage an irrigation district. I'm the executive director for the East Kaweah GSA. I think farming is essential industry for our country. We need to eat. I believe this area was created, whoever you think created it, I think they did a good job for the very purpose of farming. And I believe we have to do things differently with our water supply. I love the earth and want it conserved. I'm a political conservative. There isn't a variance between being political conservative and a conservationist. I think they're one and the same. I believe that most of my peers, at least that I know, share similar perspectives. I want to share with you a couple of just real quick facts. The dire situation that we're facing here in the Kaweah subbasin area. We have, since 1950, the district I managed has also been taking temperature gauge, has a temperature gauge, a rain gauge, and water depth analysis since 1950. Since 1950, 72 years, between 2007 and 2021, 1 year was in the top 10 wettest of that 72-year period. However, 5 were in the top 10 driest. In fact, the top 2 driest are in that. So this year in 2014. And so the question is, are we in a sustained drought? And this is probably going to answer the question. Average rainfall in Lindsay in that period of time is 9.10 inches. So roughly 2 inches less than the historical average over the 72-year period. 10 of the years were below average and 5 were above. That's not a good nominal relationship if you're trying to look for balancing. And then the dry periods average 6.5 inches, the wet periods average 14.44. So if you put those two together, you're hoping to come out somewhere around 11 inches. We're so dry in the past, since 2007, we're not getting there. That has dire consequences, and we have to do something different. So we're trying to develop a nexus between SGMA, or this Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, and land that is potentially going to be needed to be repurposed. So our overdraft is unsustainable. It's determined by our basin study. We're overdrafting 80,000 acre feet a year. My guess is it's substantially higher than that, maybe 50% more. Reduction of groundwater extraction is necessary and will soon be occurring in the Kaweah subbasin. We believe all three GSAs are of the same mind, moving towards some limitation. So with limiting supply, it's going to change what's being farmed and likely a reduction of ground agricultural land is also inevitable. And to solve the entire problem by land repurposing 25,000 acres. So what do you do with those 25,000 acres? Hopefully projects will be implemented to also assist. But right now it's, if we did this all by land retirement, we're in that 25,000 acre range. So an RCIS provides a voluntary option for landowners to reduce the loss of producing agricultural land impact by creating conservation space in conjunction with the RCIS investments. So let's learn about RCIS real briefly. RCIS, it's Regional Conservation Investment Strategy. It's pretty self-explanatory if you look at every word. The region, meaning our region being the Kaweah subbasin, we've been provided a grant to do this RCIS document by Wildlife Conservation Board. It's a little over $400,000. The RCIS establishes a mechanism for voluntary opportunities to convert land into conservation space with funding. So there's no land, there's no policy directives, no forcing the people to move land into retirement. It's simply a voluntary action. It's essentially that catalog, going to the catalog and saying, look, I have the right ground. Maybe this ground, I can convert some of it or all of it and reduce my impact overdraft of groundwater. So investing in these conservation will be by other individuals or maybe even local individuals, but through mitigation agreements, grants, developers, private donations, etc. And in the end, this repurposed land, so once producing some monetary crop, will now be conserved and have other purpose and value. So it's not just becoming worthless ground that weeds just grow on. It also reduces the groundwater footprint. So if you take 25,000 acres out of production and that's just left to fallow permanently, things are gonna look terrible. People lose money when they fallow 25,000 acres. So there's a need for it, a need for this product. So RCIS, let me give you an example out of my work. An agency in the state might go, I need to mitigate for a species over here. Look at Kaweah subbasin's RCIS. They got space, they got the species that I need to mitigate for. Let's work with them. Let's work with a landowner and get that done. That's an example of how that might work. We are not, let me see, make sure I didn't miss a page. Okay. At the current rate, we've studied this pretty thoroughly, and it is not, our approach to groundwater extraction is not sustainable. But watershed management, meaning the lower watershed at this point, we want to find a nexus to the upper watershed and slow that water flow in to the streams and fill those fissures and everything we can up and create a space for us to put water as it comes down into the valley and fills in the valley as well. Water always moves downhill, and most of the conditions of the Kaweah subbasin are hydrologic, meaning we don't have precipitation or stream inflow sufficiently enough to do what we're doing the way we're doing it. And there's a smidgen of regulatory impacts, and in particular, the San Joaquin Restoration Program took in the range of about 25,000 acre feet, 30,000 acre feet away. That's the long-term effect. I watched a program on YouTube a couple months ago. It was this Australia guy who owned a bunch of ground and he wanted to farm it, but the ground was being leached completely out. So he began this program where he's slowing the water down as it comes through his property, taking advantage of all these inflows. And during the long drought they had a couple years back, he always had water in his particular area. And it's when we talk about elevation in Australia, they're nothing like the elevations we're dealing with here. But it's he created an estuary, not an estuary, but a place that was sustainable in terms of getting water in his ground. So I wanted just to conclude with these thoughts. Sigma's purpose is to extract groundwater in a sustainable way. We're not doing that. The conditions in our subbasin are pretty dire, and farmland production is going to happen. It's just going to have to be reduced. Either we are more efficient in the amount of water, we reduce the amount of water needed for the crops, or we entirely eliminate crops. The RCIS provides a voluntary approach to repurposing, and watershed health is essential in getting water into the aquifer, which is an imperative. We've got to have water. As you notice, we had five wet years, and they weren't even wet. I would say 4 wet years out of that 2007 to 2021 period were in the wetter, above 11 inches, and that water that's coming in should be reserved for periods of dryness that we're facing now, and we need to get to that through this nexus. One opportunity is solving that. It's not a panacea, but I do believe it will be very helpful to have a collaboration with state efforts and mitigating, creating conservation space, reducing the footprint on our groundwater demand. And that's all I have.
Thank you, Mike. That's super helpful. And I appreciate you kind of sharing more details about the RCIS. And one question I also we'll open it up to others in a moment to questions. And there really are intended at this point is to ask some straightforward clarifying questions. We'll have more time for discussion a little bit later on, or more in depth as we go. And it looks like we've got at least one hand up already, so we'll get to that in a moment. But Mike, how far are you into the process in terms of identifying properties and having landowners, either assessing the situation or kind of they're raising their own hand to say, okay, I'm ready to look at a way to retire my land or repurpose it more specifically?
Well, the RCIS is in process right now. We're developing that strategy document, which it doesn't identify a piece of land. It identifies types of land and identifies species. So once the document is complete and approved by the state, it gets used by folks looking to mitigate for their actions elsewhere, or even provide opportunities locally to use that for offsets.
Great, thank you. Sarah, it looks like you have your hand up. Is that to ask a question of Mike?
Yeah, if that's okay.
Yeah, please. Yeah, great.
Oh, actually, I have I have a question and a comment, I guess. First of all, Mike, thank you. That was really interesting. I am curious if you have a sense of, in those wet years, let's see if I can phrase this, how much of that runoff you're seeing in actually direct impact on groundwater levels versus surface flows then infiltrating into the ground. I'm just thinking about that groundwater flow directly from the upper watershed. I don't even know if that question is answerable or if I'm being clear, but
that's a good question. I can answer that, at least to this point. So obviously when water enters the stream, it's moving a lot quicker, right? And it's getting away from where it was developed. So when it gets into the valley and it gets into a stream, it tends to want to get out the quickest way possible. It's a water, and it flows to the easiest place it can flow to. So what we need to do in the upper watershed and the lower watershed is slow where it goes in order to get it in the ground. And so recharge facilities is one multi-benefit recharge facilities. An example, EDF and Lindmore and SRT have worked on and are potentially going to receive a grant from Wildlife Conservation Board for a flyway in a recharge facility that we're going to be developing. That water would obviously, that's absent us taking that water, it would have gone downstream and out to the ocean ultimately. So we're taking that water and spreading it across the basin, hoping that it will will get into the ground through that spreading process. And we have infiltration rates and those types of things to consider, but that's ultimately what we're trying to accomplish.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks. And yeah, I'm interested to hear that. And then just my other comment is, if you all are I'm sure are engaged in the 30 by 30, the state discussions around the 30 by 30 plan, it just seems to me that the land being fallowed under SGMA is something that group should be paying attention to in terms of potential, as you said, with this group as potential conservation areas, and it might be worth tapping into those policy discussions to make sure that those are being considered. So that's all. Thank you.
Yeah, definitely. That's, and something we've also considered.
That's a great point, Sarah. And yeah, there's a lot of interest and energy around that right now, and so that's going to be definitely something to be paying attention to as we go forward. And there'll be a little bit more commentary actually in a little while from Anna Schiller about some related efforts in terms of funds coming from the state as well. And just for those that are curious to learn more, in the chat you'll see a link to there's a link to the Kaweah RCIS. There's a website there, and then there's also one for a general RCIS webpage as well. So please take a look at those. We'll also put those in the notes as well after the call. Thanks, Mike. We really appreciate it. We'll save any other questions that we have for a little bit later on, other than one really quick one. Someone thought they heard you mentioned Tango Farm. Did we hear that right? And what is that? Is that the name of your farm?
No, Tango is I guess the store name would be Cuties, or
Oh, okay, got it.
It's a variety of orange, easy pill, smaller orange. It's a tangerine.
Tangerine, got it.
12 acres of that, and then I have some ground. I'm in a family deal up in Northern California. That's almonds and walnuts, mostly walnuts.
Great, thank you for clarifying that. Okay, so now we want to shift gears to hear from Anna Schiller from EDF, talking about their related efforts as it relates to SGMA and land repurposing. So Anna, are you?
Yes, I can go ahead and share my screen.
Fantastic.
There we go. And first off, just want to give a really hearty thank you to the Tulare Basin Watershed Partnership Network for putting this together. These kind of conversations and kind of connective tissue are so needed to address such a major issue. And also big shout out to Mike and thanking him for going first and providing a really great concrete example of what beneficial land repurposing can look like and what an innovative partner looks like. It's been really a joy working with Mike, and he's been really taking the lead on trying out new things as we face kind of an uncertain future as it relates to groundwater and land use. So I can start things off. My name's Anna Schiller. I work at Environmental Defense Fund. I'm filling in today for Ann Hayden. We work on EDF's California water team. And I'm going to be talking a little bit today about SGMA and land repurposing. What is land repurposing and how can we see it happen? And to kick off, I might just give a little bit of an overview of Environmental Defense Fund and how we typically work and how our Western Water Program works specifically. So Environmental Defense Fund is a national nonprofit group. We try to take science, economics, advocacy, and partnerships to try and find solutions to environmental issues that are going to work for everyone involved, for people, nature, and communities. And specifically when it comes to water sustainability, our Western Water Program is focused on rebalancing water systems to be more resilient to climate change and other stressors that are affecting systems, with a keen eye to making sure that agricultural systems are able to be sustained into the future and that environmental and community needs are also being met. We've been working on sustainable groundwater management for about 5 or 6 years as a program. I've been with EDF for 3 years full-time now, and I actually started as a graduate student 4 years ago working with EDF, recognizing that groundwater is such an important component to resilient water systems. It really is that backup savings account that water users can call upon in times of need. And as Mike really illustrated so clearly, California is facing more and more years of need. So it's critical, more so than ever, to make sure that we're taking care of this super valuable resource and really this source of natural infrastructure we have for free storage of fresh water. As you all are probably pretty familiar with, the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act was passed in 2014, and it will require critically overdrafted basins to achieve sustainability by 2040 or 2042. In the San Joaquin Valley, that deadline is mostly 2040 because of the state of overdraft in the region. One of the kind of unfortunate pieces of SGMA and achieving sustainability is that there will need to be a rebalancing of supply and demand. And this will likely lead to a reduction in irrigated acreage in the next couple of decades. Some estimates go as low as 500 million acres, some go up to 1 million acres and above, which is really a massive area of land. It's kind of hard to get your head around. It's about the area of Yosemite National Park, and you could think of it as 10 to 20% of irrigated agriculture in the San Joaquin Valley. This obviously poses a huge threat. It's not a desirable outcome for anyone. Unmanaged fallowing can have severe economic impacts on agricultural industries. It can be a source of dust, pests, and weeds, which can impact both neighboring agricultural operations as well as the communities, rural communities in particular, that live in the valley. And it's also can be a source of invasive species infestation, and can have negative impacts on the biodiversity of the region as well. So this is clearly an issue that needs attention. And as the last couple of years of drought are showing, we're already seeing fallowing, unmanaged fallowing and idle fields in the Central Valley more broadly. And there's a serious need to address and manage these lands in a way that, first off, avoids those kind of negative impacts of dust, weeds, and pests, but also there's an opportunity to create new value on those lands as well. So an alternative to kind of idle fields or fallowed unmanaged lands is land repurposing. Land repurposing is an intentional conversion of a once irrigated field, irrigated crop, to a new use that's still going to generate some type of value. And that could be economic value, social value, environmental value, or all of the above. Some example of land repurposing options include things like managed grazing, dryland ag and cover crops, some that can create pollinator habitats, multi-benefit recharge basins, and restored floodplains, such as Mike described, which can create benefits for migratory waterfowl. It can improve water quality in certain situations, and it can mitigate flood risk. Solar is another option that is, I think, gaining a lot of steam. And there's also important to highlight opportunities to have solar development that's going to be in least conflict with potential endangered species habitat, as well as be designed in ways that are going to provide some sort of ecosystem benefits as well. Another land use that we've heard in particular rural communities advocate for and be in favor of is creating more open space or recreational areas for community members there's a huge disparity in the access to open space and parks, particularly in the San Joaquin Valley, but really across the state. So I think there's opportunities for thoughtful planning around land repurposing that can provide those rural community benefits, as well as buffer zones in between rural communities and ag, where that might be of interest to certain community members. And then lastly, habitat restoration, particularly if habitat restoration can be done strategically in order to create habitat corridors and connect existing conservation areas in order to really give endangered and threatened species in the valley a real shot at population recovery and full recovery of endangered species, I guess, would be a really high objective, but also just more broadly enhancing biodiversity in the San Joaquin Valley. And all these things sound really nice, but obviously there's a lot of challenges and barriers to getting there. Specifically, when you think about how certain alternative land uses are only going to be successful in certain areas or have a lot more potential to be successful if sited appropriately. And just to overview some important characteristics of successful land repurposing programs or strategies. One, you want to minimize agricultural impacts. You don't want to be repurposing on the most productive or best prime farmland areas. You want to maximize local community benefits where possible, decrease groundwater demand, obviously, or replenish groundwater supplies in the case of groundwater recharge, and hopefully also increase benefits for wildlife. So in order to achieve each of these things, it requires a certain level of coordination and planning, as well as incentives or funding to support them. This is something where the RCIS, I think, is a really good example of a program or a strategy that's achieving kind of addressing both of those major barriers. Part one, it has the planning and coordination at a larger regional scale, and then it also has this mechanism to help bring funding to the area. And incentive payments are just a really important piece as well, because much of this land repurposing, all of the land repurposing is going to happen on a voluntary basis for the most part. These are privately held agricultural lands. So making sure we have the right kind of incentive payments in order to motivate land repurposing in areas where it's going to be most effective is really important. Next up, I'm going to talk about a couple of different EDF initiatives that are meant to address these two different barriers that we see. The first is around planning and coordination. So back in fall and winter of 2020, EDF hosted a 4-part workshop series that brought together local stakeholders. So we had folks like Groundwater Sustainability Agency representatives, irrigation district representatives, county planners, local conservation groups, environmental justice and advocacy groups come together to talk about what would regional or local coordination look like to develop a land repurposing program that can both plan and strategize where land can be repurposed and to what uses, and then also where can we generate new sources of funding or direct existing sources of funding to help make that plan a reality. It was really important to us that we had a group of stakeholders that were based in the San Joaquin Valley to have this discussion, and that our main takeaways and synthesis, which we put into a white paper, wouldn't be a strict roadmap of you have to do X, Y, and Z. This is what the best kind of regional land repurposing program looks like. Recognizing that it's going to be so specific region to region, based on who's living there, based on the conditions, based on the priorities and preferences of different groups. So rather than have, step A, B, C, D necessarily, or a program has to look exactly like this, instead, when synthesizing kind of the conversations from that workshop, we put together a white paper that raises the key questions and considerations that folks can be asking themselves as they're developing these programs to make sure that they're being comprehensive and inclusive in generating a program. So I'll add a link. I wish I had it ready. I'll add a link at the end of my presentation to that white paper that has those different components to it. And that was released in April 2021, so it's relatively fresh. Another initiative that EDF is working on is the Multi-Benefit Land Repurposing Incentive Program Act, or AB 252. This is a piece of legislation that we are sponsoring that would create a new funding program housed at the Department of Conservation, California's Department of Conservation. And what this program would do is it would provide block grants to local agencies like GSAs or counties that have developed somewhat of a game plan for land repurposing, deliver those block grants to those local agencies to then provide incentive payments to landowners who want to voluntarily repurpose their land to other beneficial uses. We're really excited about this program. We're hoping that it will be well funded. I think there is a general recognition that this is an urgent issue. And so it's been moving pretty well through the legislative process. It's authored by Assembly Member Robert Rivas. It made it through the Assembly Committee earlier this month. It went to the Senate Natural Resources and Water Committee. Next up, it will be going to the Senate Governance and Finance Committee before moving on to appropriations. Obviously, a big piece of the success of this program is going to be how much funding it receives, and that is something that is still under negotiation, the drought package piece of the budget. So we are strongly advocating for that to be as well funded as possible. The governor proposed in his May budget revise $500 million. That's a huge, amazing amount, and probably 10 times the amount we've ever thought we could potentially receive for this program. We've been the Senate or the Assembly is pitching for something more like 50 million. So it's still being negotiated. If folks are interested and excited about this program, if they want to learn more about it, I'm happy to talk about it. If you want to advocate for it by contacting your representative and saying, look, I think this is an important program and deserves funding, we also have a package that we just developed that has a script and some directions on how you can get in touch with your assembly member or senator if that's of interest. So happy to answer more questions on that. I'm looking at the clock and I'm running out of time, so I can also, and I'm getting to the end, so I can wrap up and just say a hearty thank you again to the organizers, and I look forward to more discussion. Thanks.
Thank you, Anna. That was really great. Really nice to, well, the visuals are quite helpful in kind of making it really clear how EDF is approaching strategic land repurposing. It's pretty intriguing. And just some basic questions that have come up is, one simple one is, what exactly is dry land ag? That's one question. Is if I'm assuming that requires little or no water. That's one question. And the second one is a little bit more involved, that maybe we'd even open this up a little bit just to get a little bit more perspective on this. Is how does one determine what high value agriculture is? Is it an economic element? Is it a certain element of diversity and crop type? The ability to actually provide product locally in California versus sending it overseas. So if you could talk about both what dry land ag is and how one determines what high value agricultural land is.
Yeah, those are both really great questions. I'll start with the first, which is dryland agriculture. And this would be primarily just rain-fed agriculture that can sustain on precipitation alone. And this might be a more viable strategy in the northern San Joaquin Valley that receives a little bit more precipitation, but it might be something like a winter wheat. So it's really based on kind of your local conditions, if you might be able to sustain a crop that doesn't require additional irrigation beyond precipitation. And I'd invite anyone else on here with a stronger ag background if you would like to modify that definition to hop in. For the second question around what is high value ag, that's an awesome question and something that I think is open to interpretation, and the answer would probably change based on who you ask. I think there are some general ways that the state has tried to categorize high value or prime farmland based on like soil characteristics. But you raised a good point as well around crop diversity being an important piece too. And when you think about resilience, for example, having crop diversity is a really important aspect in order to have more flexibility in the system and more, just diversity is a major factor of resilience, right? So that you have more more crops to choose from, and that they can, if you're not sure how a certain crop might withstand a disease or pest, having a broader array is going to make you a little stronger agricultural system. So I think that's something that's to be determined. And yeah, I'd be curious too to see about how like local jurisdictions might be thinking about how they want to prioritize different crop uses and what kind of agriculture they want to make sure sustains through the implementation of SGMA. So I think that's like definitely a question of local preferences and priorities as well.
Great. Okay. Thank you. That's very helpful. And then we have one more question. We don't have a lot of time, but hopefully this one's a little more straightforward, which is, could you say a little bit more about the time length of the repurposing benefit? Is it temporary? Does it depend upon what the landowner wishes? Do they have options? Can you say more about the timing?
Yeah, excellent question. So at least for AB 252, which would create the multi-benefit land repurposing incentive program, it was really important to us that we include a range of time commitments that landowners can choose from. So minimum of 10 years up to permanent projects. And this is reflective of really where I think a lot of growers are at right now, with having a high degree of uncertainty about how much water they're going to have in the decades to come, how much they'll be able to farm. So being able to try out different contracts and understanding that not all those land repurposing options are going to work well on a temporary basis. But for example, you could convert to a pollinator-friendly cover crop for a term of 10 years, create some really nice short-term benefits that are measurable, and then also have more long-term options available as well for someone that maybe wants to restore endangered species habitat. They could pursue a conservation easement that's more of a permanent agreement under this program.
Great, thank you very much. There probably are more questions. There's some comments in the chat as well, but unfortunately, just sort of timing wise, we need to move on. Thank you so much, Anna. That was really great. It was a nice combo with Mike's perspective. And we'll hopefully have a little bit more time for discussion as we get into that later part of our call here. But I want to now turn it over to Stacie Ann Silva with New Current Water and Land LLC to kind of tie some of these threads together and share both the big picture in terms of challenges as well as opportunities. So Stacie Ann, are you good to go?
I am. I'm struggling to present, so you'll have to tell me if you're seeing this in the screen sharing has failed to start.
Oh, I haven't, not there yet. We need another moment.
Just a second. Sorry, everybody. Let's see if this fixes it.
Something's happening. There we go. Is
All
that
right.
Is that the image that you wanted to share?
Are you seeing presenter view, or are you all seeing the
actual presenter view? It looks very clean. Thank you. It's good.
swap? Okay. I think I may have just messed it up. There we go.
There we go. Oh,
All right. All right. Hello, everyone. I'm Stacie Ann. As Robert mentioned, I work for a company called New Current Water and Land, which most of you have probably never heard of, but it is 4 principals. Dan Dooley, Dick Moss, Dave Orr, Gary Sawyers, and then I am their sole employee right now. So I monitor SGMA implementation in roughly 73 GSAs and 40 different subbasins throughout the state. You can see on the map, I tried to kind of draw a line of where I stop and where I go to in the state. So it's a vast majority of the state of California. And we also assist clients with special projects like the RCIS development. So we serve as a strategic advisor for EDF on this. So they asked me to kind of speak about conservation strategies, but also kind of bring it back to a larger picture. So where we are right now with SGMA, I think, is a bit misunderstood. So I know, Anna, you mentioned the timeline, and many of you probably know it like the back of your hand. But just so for clarity's sake, sustainability must be reached by 2040 and maintained through 2070. So what that means is that the GSPs that were submitted are the very first step. Most of the GSAs were created in 2017. They gathered data and technical expertise for 3 years and developed the rules for governing, and submitted a plan that is now kind of full force being implemented, which means that the majority of the work that the GSAs have done up to this point has been focused on data gathering, technical support, establishing monitoring networks, all of that kind of thing. So because of this, I think it's good to understand what the structure looks like in the Tulare Lake Basin. And I took out the non-critically overdrafted subbasins, not because they are not important, but because in terms of where the overdraft is, I think it's pretty obvious that the critically overdrafted are the worst. So you can see that there are 36 GSAs and 23 GSPs just in that Tulare Lake Basin hydrologic region. Each of these GSAs operates independently. They have to coordinate under a subbasin coordination agreement, but for the most part, the GSAs implemented and developed projects, management actions, and kind of their day-to-day operations are solo in their own silo. That's not to say they don't collaborate. The Kaweah subbasin, for example, has quarterly meetings where all 3 GSAs get together, as does the Tulare, but they're really independent agencies. And I think that's important when you try to think about scaling up, doing a landscape-based conservation strategy is where are you really looking at and who are you really talking to? And so we talked about the Kaweah subbasin, being where the RCIS is focused. And so that Kaweah subbasin, East Kaweah GSA, which Mike Hagman spoke earlier, was the proponent, but the other 2 GSAs are also involved in the process. So weaving it all together, the GSAs have massive holes to fill. I went through the 2020 annual reports this morning and filled in the overdraft. And for 2020, which as Mike Hagman pointed out earlier, was a dry year, we experienced about 2 million acre feet of overdraft in those high priority critically overdrafted subbasins in the Tulare Lake region. And you can see it's kind of disproportionately spread out, but the bottom line is that these GSAs have a massive hole to fill, and you can't really get there using only one strategy or another. And that's where you get to these collaborative actions like an RCIS, or my understanding of what you all are here doing today is coming up with bigger ideas that manage the landscape and the region as a whole. Each of the GSAs, however, is concerned with their portion of their chunk of their subbasins overdraft. And so again, that's a big issue, and I'll say it repeatedly because it is one of the major barriers to creating a landscape level solution, is that the GSAs themselves are responsible for their area. And again, there's collaboration and communication within them. But at the end of the day, the role of a GSA is to solve the overdraft in or meet sustainability for their area. So how do we weave it all together then? If everybody's working on these separate issues, if they're all kind of operating on their own but collaboratively, you start with tools. So tools in the toolbox for a GSA may include something like supply enhancement. We saw most of the GSAs start here. So, what recharge can you do? How can you optimize your current supply, surface water supplies, et cetera? Talking about upper watershed enhancement to bring more water down onto the valley floor. Demand reductions usually comes next. And this is where, by the way, the place that they are on my slide doesn't matter anymore. Demand reduction comes next, and that is where you start to think about, do we charge for use over sustainable yield? Do we allocate to individual GSAs and let the GSA kind of manage it? Do we allocate to individual landowners and let the landowners manage their individual water budgets? And from my perspective, this is one of the biggest things that you have to do before you can even start talking about a repurposing program, because the individual landowner has to know what their role is and what hole they have to fill before they feel the need to reach out and try and expand beyond just increasing efficiency on their property. Groundwater markets are usually a way that landowners can kind of function and trade within each other to try and make themselves whole. I will note, Jeff, you asked me to touch on some of where we're at. There is a functioning groundwater market already in that region, and it is in the Tulare subbasin. And so they have not only a few places where they are doing inside the GSA trading, but a few of those GSAs are also trading within each other right now. And Every time I talk about a groundwater market, it's important to note groundwater markets and surface water markets are not the same thing. They operate extremely differently because of the recognition in SGMA that you have to avoid undesirable results. Then you can start talking about things like repurposing and, okay, I'm an individual landowner, I know what my budget is, where do I go from here, which is where the RCIS comes in. So weaving it all together for you, just hypothetical subbasin that has allocated, to each individual GSA, you have this much water or this much of the overdraft. And then an individual landowner comes in and says, okay, my share of that sustainable yield is X and my demand is here. So I need to make up this hole for myself, or the GSA says we need to make up this hole for ourselves. And that is where you start to get to things like repurposing. So a GSA could look at that hole and say, okay, I filled a little bit of it with supply enhancement. I got quite a bit more with demand reduction, or I filled a little bit with supply enhancement and I don't want to allocate to individual landowners. I just want to outright reduce the amount of water that's used. And you can do that by, as a GSA or using state funding or GSA funding, purchasing irrigated cropland and using that, just taking it out of production so that it's no longer using groundwater and you now have that savings in your account. I will note one of the big things about repurposing without a demand reduction component, one of the biggest issues is that you end up as a GSA or a state entity or a grant program buying the property at crop value, which means that you buy that property at its market value, which is $17,500 or $38,000 an acre, depending on where it's at. You're not buying it at a repurposed value. So if you reduce demand first and you show landowners and you show the larger market that this isn't worth as much without water, you can bring down the cost of land, which from a landowner perspective, I know is not what you want, but it enables the money to go further. So that 50 to 500 million Anna was talking about earlier goes a lot further if the value of the water is already tied into the value of the property. So all the GSAs have to do is put this all together into a nice little sustainability toolbox and reach sustainability, right? It sounds really simple, but it's not. So how do we get there? What's next? I think the very first thing you have to do is to recognize there are huge cultural differences, and we ran into this with the RCIS. Farmers are optimists, and if they weren't optimists, they wouldn't be farmers. And so one of the first things you hear when you mention to a landowner, well, you don't have enough water next year is, okay, well, next time there's a wet year, I will. There just needs to be a big wet year, and then I can harvest everything and make, and keep everything going. And, oh, I can plant that block that I took out of production. So I think understanding kind of the difference in perspective, whereas from, maybe a conservator perspective, you're thinking there isn't enough water, which Mike showed us, there's massive holes in the San Joaquin Valley. And so you just assume that everybody knows there's not enough water, but you have to remember that farmers are optimists. And so kind of bridging that gap of understanding, I think, is a crucial component of getting anything on repurposing done. You also, there's a big, moment to find common ground. I really appreciated the Tulare Basin Watershed Partnership Network's purpose statement to generate and implement integrated, inclusive, and innovative solutions to advance ecosystem and watershed resilience and socioeconomic stability. I think that last section is very important because, as Anna pointed out, there is a lot of land that could potentially go out of production, and that creates not only the economic problem for the person whose land went out of production, but it creates air quality problems. It creates nuisance problems with dust and weeds, and so kind of looking at it as a big picture is a big piece of finding that common ground. And SGMA actually pushes us all to be working on the same problem. We're all trying to reach sustainability. And the way that sustainability is defined, I think, is holistic enough to where we're finally all kind of looking in the same direction. And then setting up the basics. So Anna mentioned the length of repurposing agreements. That's also one of the first things we hear from landowners when we talk about repurposing is that optimism. Well, I only need a 1-year contract because next year there'll be enough water. And so figuring out what length of an agreement is correct is a big part of being able to replicate something like this, and creating that flexibility is going to be crucial to getting landowners to voluntarily sign on, especially in those places where they don't have an allocation that's kind of forcing them to restrict their use. And then managing the entity and the funding sources, and then you repeat. So that's just kind of a broad overview of the region and some of the things that we found working on SGMA and land repurposing. And I'm looking forward to the question and answer section.
Thanks so much, Stacie Ann. That was great. Really appreciate it. And boy, I don't think I fully appreciated how many GSAs you are working with. It's sort of a little mind-boggling. So it's wonderful to kind of have your finger on the pulse of so many different entities, for sure. So any questions for Stacie Ann at this point? I know that some of you maybe have to jump off because we're at the hour here, but I hope that that's not including say goodbye. We're hoping that you can stay here for sure. And I'm just going to swing back to this just question of what questions do you have for Stacie Ann?
I either did a great job or I just absolutely threw way too much information at you all.
And you also had the pleasure of being the third speaker as well. I can start with one that's come up, which is in terms of demand reduction. I know that, it's not uncommon to look at, water efficiency, irrigation efficiency, crop substitution. You could maybe even put repurposing in there. I know there's also a lot more talk about, healthy soils and regenerative agriculture and kind of climate-wise farming. Is there much sense, especially in the southern San Joaquin, that there are strategies that can help conserve water just in terms of soil growth and management and health overall?
So I've spent thank you for the question. I've spent quite a bit of time on this, in particular with the California Climate and Agriculture Network, discussing kind of what you need to marry carbon sequestration using cover crops and soil health benefits with groundwater sustainability. There is definitely some overlap there. I think that the thing that needs to be said is that the whole is so massive in terms of groundwater, that just for the groundwater overuse, that you can't really make it up with efficiency. And I say that as someone who came out of Cal Poly's ag engineering program. There isn't enough efficiency in the world to make up the problem that we have. So it helps and it could be part of the toolbox, but it's not going to solve the problem. On the note of, marrying cover cropping and healthy soils initiatives, the main issue is that a cover crop still uses water. So while it is creating a benefit to the soil, it's a water user. And so if you are looking at places like the Tulare subbasin, where your sustainable yield, what you can pump in 2040, assuming no other projects, no other things like that, is 0.15 acre feet per acre, you start to pay attention to every 1/10 of an acre foot you're using. And so in areas that you can have a little more flexibility, I think it's a much more attractive benefit, but I think that it still needs to be an important part of the conversation.
Great. Yeah, it does sound like these healthy soil practices are just there's no way it's a silver bullet, right? It's just one of the added tools in the toolbox or practices that you have to consider. Other questions? We have another question that's come in, but I wanted to see just anybody else either via the chat or by voice has something they want to ask Stacie Ann right now. I'm not seeing it. So one of the questions that has also come up that we wanted you to actually address is this sense of kind of interbasin coordination and some of the challenges with that. And there's some that say, oh, well, it's, we don't see farmers or water managers really doing a lot of that. Why aren't they doing that? What's the issue there? And any thoughts you have about that, what you're seeing in terms of how that is a challenge and how that might be addressed?
Yes, interbasin coordination is a requirement of SGMA, so it is happening. The main issue is that the GSPs, the groundwater sustainability plans, are massive documents and they're massive technical documents. Most of them are above 1,000 pages, and I read all of them, so believe me when I say they're above 1,000 pages. But you as an agency were created in 2017. You had to put together your governance, your board of directors. You had to establish, if you were going to have committees, what kinds of committees, who was going to sit on them, in which 3 years sounds like a lot of time to put all that together, but you had 3 years to do that and create your plan that has to pass DWR's test. And also SGMA's brand spanking new. It's one of the largest pieces of water legislation that's passed in the past 100 years. And so while it was passed in 2014-15, it wasn't really on anybody's radar until 17. And it still wasn't on most people's radar until 2020 when the plans were submitted. So I think that it can't overstate the monumental lift that the GSAs had to do in the past 4 years. And so I think there's a fair share of just being overwhelmed with the amount of information. A lot of this basin studies and things of that nature, this was the first time it had been done in many of these places. And so getting technical experts on board, getting a good understanding of the area you were dealing with was a monumental effort. So just getting those plans put together sucked all the oxygen out of the room. And so I think now once we start seeing, as we've started to see kind of DWR release a few plan reviews and work through those issues, we're seeing the GSAs take a little bit of a breath, not much. They still have a lot to do, and I'll be the first one to tell them that. And I know a few of you are on the line, but they're able to now kind of, peer through the stack of papers and technical reports that they've created in the past 3 years and really start to talk to their neighbors about what are you doing, how are we affecting that, and create some of those interbasin efforts. So I think it was just a matter of them absolutely overwhelmed with the amount of information there was to learn, and also, creating documents for a program while the regulations about that document were being drafted. So you're drafting your document at the same time the regulations are being drafted, and that's a bit of a challenge.
Thank you. And it comes back to also some of the comments that Mike made, just in terms of, I think it's important for those that are not a GSA or involved with them to just appreciate the complexity and the challenge, and have at least some empathy for what the monumental task before them. It's not to say that there isn't a desire for them to do more or to, help address, other, community benefits and interests, but I think we just would all do well to kind of just, acknowledge and appreciate all that they've been tasked with, which is the first time ever. They're cutting some detail here for sure.
I track all these GSAs, and believe me, I would love it probably more than most of you if they would just decide everything right now and have everything figured out. But reality is that that's just not feasible.
Unfolding, yeah, exactly. Well, I think things will get even more interesting as more of these plans get approved and some of them start getting implemented. There'll be whole nother phases of kind of complexity and excitement around the actual on the ground work. So thanks so much, Stacie Ann. This is really great. We have time for some discussion now and questions that we've got prepared, as well as ones that we would love to hear from the audience, so to speak. So please, if you would, in the chat, please add your questions in there, unless you prefer to ask that question live, and just raise your hand. We'll get to you in a little bit. Before we do, we also wanted to address this question of connecting, and it's brought up a couple times already on the call today, sort of the connection between the lower and upper watersheds, and that as one element of our kind of more integrated, resilient approach to water stewardship and sustainability in the region. No small task, as I had mentioned earlier. And so I just want to kind of get a sense from all the speakers here. What do you see as the importance of connecting the upper and lower watersheds? What are some of the benefits? And I think with the recognition too, that maybe in some of the dry years, there may not be a lot of water availability there, and that gets down to the lower watershed. But maybe at least think in terms of quote unquote normal years or wetter years, what might the potential be? So I'm just going to open it up to the three of you. It can be Stacie, Mike, or Anna to start with. Any thoughts?
Anna and Stacie first.
I was going to also just piggyback off something. I think Mike kind of made a reference to this earlier on, but as you mentioned, I think the connectivity is going to become more apparent in those wetter years. And we're seeing more extremes on both sides. We're seeing more intense and prolonged droughts, but we're also seeing our wet years, precipitation is arriving in really kind of flashy periods. Atmospheric rivers are delivering a higher proportion of our annual water each year. So understanding that the best time to start planning for wet years is dry years, and having things like recharge basins or restored floodplains in place and ready to receive those peak flows, those flashy flood risk flows when they do happen is really important. And as much as we can design those types of systems to layered benefits, we're going to be better off. So Mike is a great example of that. Trying out a new approach to designing a recharge basin that's going to have some benefits for wildlife in that project he mentioned earlier. So just, yeah, having the lower watershed be prepared to receive, slow, spread, and sink those flashy flow events is really going to be important moving forward. And then also very important in trying to bolster groundwater supplies as much as possible when there is water available.
Yeah, and so that's recharge basins that need to be ready to capture water all throughout the winter, unfortunately, right? Because there may be, periods in the middle of the winter when it's actually raining and not snowing. So that is also something that you're contemplating. Is that part of the design? That it's not just assuming, a spring runoff or a late spring runoff. Is that fair to say?
Yeah. I mean, you got to prepare for effects of global warming, and then the scientists are saying that that's going to be higher snow levels, lower runoff, quicker runoff, and so you'll have reduced snow storage, and that water is going to come off those hills quicker, enter the streams, and you need to collect that. And the other concern in the collection piece of it is to convey it, because we don't have the space in terms of reservoirs, dams, and there seems to be almost no appetite for dams by the state of California to improve collecting that supply, but conveying it also is going to be essential. And our Lindmore irrigation district, as an example, we have 5 irrigation districts in a city that all receive CVP supply. And the city has times when they have more supply than they can use. So they conjunctively work through that with the district, and we take the water, and that means we use less groundwater and they use more groundwater. We'll take the surface supply. So it's essential to understand that we have to convey these wet periods. That's where if the state were to focus on planning, that's one of the biggest areas SGMA has identified is conveyance to places where you can put water.
Right. So it's sort of an addition to what Anna was talking about, that moniker of or the pseudo what is that the expression of sink, slow, spread, slow, sink, spread, I guess I would say. And then you have to add part of that spread is actually convey, right? Because it's not necessarily right there at the water's edge or at the creek's edge. It might be moving it someplace else where it can provide more benefit.
That's correct.
Yeah. Okay, great. Other questions or comments? I should say comments, actually. Stacie Ann, anything else you would add to what Anna and Mike said?
Nothing to add here other than just highlighting the importance of groundwater recharge as we get into this conjunctive use cycle. As Anna was noting, we're looking at really flashy winters. And so being able to have a place to put that is set aside for that purpose, not only gives use to some retired or repurposed farmland, but also benefits the entire basin. And most GSAs are either have or are developing policies for crediting landowners for that activity, or charging funds to build conveyance to move between. So we've seen private entities do it in the past quite successfully, and this is kind of the first step of getting your feet wet as the GSA is developing those policies and getting ready to do that themselves as well.
Great. The one thing that we have been talking about as well, and this kind of is back to the theme of connecting to the upper watershed, is sort of trying to address this question or exploring the question. If you were to steward and manage upper watershed, the forests, more effectively, thinning and kind of healthier densities of trees, et cetera, what would be the potential benefit downstream? And it's sort of I think it's a complicated question. There's a lot of dimensions to it. We are fortunate to have, and Safik, hopefully you're still on the call, Safik from UC Merced, who is a geohydrologist, I believe, by training, and his job right now is his work right now with the state and with as a professor there at UC Merced. Safik, are you available just to say a little bit more about what you're seeing in terms of upper watershed contribution to the lower watershed when you actively maintain the upper watershed?
Yeah, thanks, Robert. Just to set the record straight, I know nothing about geo part, so I'm more of a
Just
hydrologist.
hydro. Okay, sorry.
I'm more of a hydrologist than geologist, but thanks for that nice introduction. Yeah, I guess, I think all the three presentations were really spot on, and I'm so fortunate to have this conversation. And I think you all have highlighted the issues and solutions, not just focusing on one solution, but focusing on multiple solutions, because that's where really the real solution is. You don't really have a silver bullet, so to speak, right? You can't just focus on efficiency, because in my mind, efficiency doesn't save water. You save water one place and then you use it somewhere else, right? As long as you have access to that water. So, efficiency is good, but sometimes it can have unintended consequences. And in part, because a lot of the issues that we are facing right now is in part driven by the efficiency. We have cut down the groundwater recharge for good or worse. So as far as the headwater management is concerned, I think some of the work that we are really focused on, again, we can think in terms of the multiple benefit when it comes to headwater management, because it's expensive. That's the first thing. It's very expensive, and you need to figure out how you're going to pay for it. It's not a one-time thing. You can't just walk into the headwaters and then manage the forest once and then say that I am done with it. You have to keep doing it over and over. So figuring out a working model or mechanism that will pay for itself is where I think a lot of the coordination and collaboration has to come from, because I think every entity, every NGO, and every individual who is interested in headwater management will come with a different set of goals and interests. So how do we put all the individual pieces together and come as a team and do the right thing and do the things that's needed, be it thinning or be it, prescribed burning, right? We all kind of understand at this point what is needed. I know Mike, really covered the essence of the climate, really nicely, because, we are really in this, roller coaster ride. We get this one, really wet year, and then 5 years in a row, we really don't get anything, right? So the climate is getting much more extreme. At the same time, it's not just like, that our climate is getting extreme. We always experience extreme climate in the California. I think the main issue is the losing the snowpack, because the snowpack was critical for our local water supply. It supplemented the water that was stored behind the dam. It supplemented the water that was in the ground. And if you lose that snowpack, that's a big chunk of storage is really gone, right? So the storage is gone. At the same time, if you look at the data in terms of the reservoir storage, and I think I looked probably like a few months ago, the top 10 reservoir storage in California, over time in the last 40, 50 years, you see that the reservoir storage actually has gone down. And although I don't understand what is, the root cause, but I would probably imagine that the loss of snowpack is playing its part, because, when you have a lot more, rain than snow, you really need to keep the reservoirs empty to accommodate for future floods, right? So your ability to store water will go down. So you're losing the snowpack. You cannot store water behind the dam as much as you were doing in the past. And, during these, big storms, I think the water just hits the stream and then runs off. So it's not even sticking around and recharging the aquifers. All of these things are actually confounding, and all driven by the same, the climate, the extreme climate that we are seeing. So again, just talking about the solution, I think what we are seeing from the data that we have collected, the headwater management can actually pay off both in terms of the water quantity as well as quality. I think the issue that we are facing as far as the Southern Sierra is concerned, I think once you pass the, Merced or Yosemite and go south, it's a very different beast. It's a very different climate, right? It's a part of California that is what we describe as water limited, right? So if you generate any additional source or supply of water, some other, trees or some other water users will actually tap on it, right? Because we really need more water in this part of the state. So, and the same is true for the headwaters. If you cut down one tree, the water that you save will likely be taken up by the trees that is, left there because they need more water. It's very hot. It's dry. So what we are seeing is really in a dry years, you don't really put any more water in the stream. So if you are trying to thin the forest to increase water supply benefit downstream, it's not going to happen in dry years when you need that water most. Most of that water supply benefit is going to come in the wet years, right? Which, still I think it's a good thing. It's a closed basin. Tulare Lake Basin is a closed basin. So regardless whether it comes in a dry year or wet year, you still, have access to that water. But what is happening, like in a dry year, the water that you save by thinning the forest will actually help improve the resilience of the remaining trees. So you are improving the headwater conditions, right? You're building the drought resilience, which in terms will make sure that your water supply in wet years are, good quality. There's not much fire. There's not much, sedimentation that is coming down. So overall, I think there's a benefit. We're just figuring out how we really, what we put in, in terms of when we quantify the benefits. Are we only talking about water supply for downstream? Are we only talking about the water quality? Are we talking about fire? Are we talking about forest health? Are we talking about habitat? And so packaging all of these benefits together will, in my mind, will pay, and bring the collaboration and workforce that's needed to do the active management. So I don't know, that's just my thought, and it's a quite lengthy thought, but I think, like this was an excellent, I think, series of presentation. I really enjoyed it. So thank you to all the three speakers.
Yeah, thank you, Safiq. That was a great kind of compliment to what they were contributing in the lower watershed and helping understand this linkages more holistically. So much appreciated. I think there seems like there's lots of questions and things that come out of this, of course, but we do need to move on. We're getting near the end of our time together. And before we go, unless there's a burning question that someone has for one of our three speakers or anything that even keying off of what Safiq just said, we want to capture some of your insights and kind of key takeaways. But before we do, I just want one last chance if anyone's got a question to ask of our speakers. Don't be shy. This is your moment. Okay, all right. It looks like it's a little quiet. There was one kind of lingering question from before. We weren't sure we had time for, but hopefully we do right at the moment, and this should be pretty quick. Back to you, Anna. And the question was, is AB 252, is that going to be for Sigma watersheds only, or is it for those watersheds that are also not listed within Sigma as well?
Yeah, that's a great question. Right now it is just for Sigma basins, and that's partly just due to the urgency of the issue in those regions. And as a first-year program, there's limited amounts of funds, but I think that's definitely something that could be considered for a further expansion in future years if we're seeing agricultural footprint reduction in other regions across the state, and if there's like a more clear and pressing need. I think there's a great opportunity to maybe advocate for expanded funding to support a broader geography across the state.
Well stated. Thanks, Anna. Good. And hopefully the person that had that question is still on the line. So we want to switch gears now briefly. You see a link in the chat, and that is, will take you to a slide, or actually slide deck, that it will capture sort of the ideas for scaling and integration. So the idea, just kind of key takeaways This format here hopefully is helpful for you. The idea is to everyone kind of collectively, if you're interested, kind of share some ideas. It'd be great to get some feedback from you on ideas and or next steps, ways we might implement some of these ideas or scale them across the region. We are going to have a session as well in the fall, like I said, where we'll talk about that. I see some folks getting on now. So when you open up the slide deck, you'll get to slide 5, the 5th slide, and you'll see a bunch of people there. So feel free to kind of use those, pick a line or two and add anything you'd like. Either, it could be a solution, strategy, or action. It could be your idea maybe around how we implement these things might be important more so than the what at this point. So feel free to add a few things there. We're just going to take a couple minutes for that. So there'll be a little bit of silence while we do so. And speakers, I'll ask you too to kind of click on that link in the chat and add a thought or two. And it may be your own idea, or maybe things that you've been advocating for, or maybe something that others have said. But please, I see some ideas going in there now, which is great. I'm just going to take another moment for that, and then we're going to wrap up with some quick closing thoughts as well. I see a bunch of ideas, so hopefully people are again, slide 5. I see a bunch of folks there actually, but maybe just thinking about what your key takeaway is. And then we're also in a moment going to talk about what's next in the next minute or two. You could also put something in the chat if you just feel like you can't get to that slide, or it's too many moving parts. You can put something in the chat as well, and we'll capture that. Okay, while that's going on simultaneously, I'm going to also I am going to just talk about what's next. So if you could type with your fingers and listen with at least one ear, we'll just quickly share some things that are coming up on the docket for the network. And I'm going to go back to present mode. So forgive me for us multitasking here. Whoops, not to thank you yet. Okay, I'm not touching the screen again. So certainly if you're interested in being involved with the network, please let us know, either through the invitation, go back to the invitation, or any of the actual individual emails you've gotten from us, through whether it's Desiree or myself. And we'd be happy to hear from you, see what you're interested in. We've had that happen before in our last session. A number of folks were interested and want to be involved more in the network. And certainly attending these series is great. So our first event already happened on July 20th, which was focused on the upper watershed. Actually, this is a misstatement here. It's actually it was the upper watershed element. That recording is coming soon. We had some technical issues with it, but we're going to fix that, and that'll be posted soon. Our third event, like I said, is coming up in September. We are co-developing a project called Sequoias to the Sloughs as well, which is a whole watershed initiative that is working with other existing partners, including the Tulare Land and Water Conservation Trust. And then we have our quarterly member meeting coming up in September. We're changing the date there somewhat, but stay tuned, and we'll give an update on that once the design team or leadership team has a chance to do so, make that date change. So thank you for attending. If you have to go, but any quick comments from anyone else on our design team? Speak, Carol, Jeff.
Not much, Robert. I mean, I already said what I wanted to say. So I really enjoyed. So thanks to all of our speakers, and it was really a productive meeting, a productive session. Let me put it that way.
Great. Thanks, Safiq. Anyone else?
Thank you so much to the Tulare Basin Watershed Partnership Network. We really appreciate this space, and thank you, Robert, for your excellent moderation. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. It's great to have you all. It made it very interesting and hard to focus between content and process. There's such great content here. Well, thank you, everybody. Have a nice afternoon. Be well, and we'll be in touch. Take care.